자, 그럼 지금부터 글로벌 인재포럼 2022 본격적인 논의의 장을 열어보도록 하겠습니다. 먼저 올해 포럼의 키워드부터 짚어봐야겠죠. 대전환과 탈세계화의 흐름 속에서 우리가 나아가야 할 미래는 과연 어디일지부터 함께 공유해 보도록 하겠습니다. 먼저 첫 번째 기조연설을 시작해 보도록 하죠. 이번 순서 기다리고 계신 분들 많이 계실 것 같은데요. 유럽연합 집행위원장 그리고 포르투갈 총리를 역임하시고 현재 골드만삭스 인터내셔널 회장과 세계 백신 면역연합 의장을 맡고 계십니다. 오늘은 세계 대전환과 탈세계화를 주제로 기조연설 수고해 주실 예정이신데요. 제가 소개해드리면 여러분 큰 박수로 환영해 주시기 바랍니다. 첫 번째 기조연설은 조제 마누엘 바호즈 회장님께서 함께 해주시겠습니다. 여러분 큰 박수 부탁드립니다. Alright, could you please come up to the stage?
Thank you very much for your kind words of introduction. First of all, let me thank you for this kind invitation from the Korean Economic Daily, from the Ministry of Education of the Republic of Korea, and also of Korean Research Institute for Vocational Education and Training. And let me also start by expressing my very deep condolences for the tragedy that has attained Korea. We are deeply sorry for what happened. We were deeply moved in Europe for those news, and we want to express our sympathy to the families of the victims and to all the Korean people. I was invited to speak with you about the great transition, deglobalization. And in fact, I believe we are today in a completely different phase of international relations. I'd like also to mention that the opinions I'm going to express are my own only. I'm not now speaking on behalf of any specific organization. I will try to share some reflections based on my experience, mainly political experience, for more than 30 years in the government of my country, where I served for 12 years in different capacities, including as foreign minister and as prime minister, and also as president of the European Commission, where I had the honor to lead the European Union for 2 mandates between 2004 and 2014. So it's basically share my experience about these matters and to compare the situation then to the situation today. But once again, the opinions that I'm going to express are my own and only my own. The situation is different today because after the moment we could consider a moment of hyper-globalization that broadly coincided with the end of the Cold War and what we could consider the victory of the Western model and of the United States, basically in the confrontation with the challenger at that moment, the Soviet Union. After that moment of hyperglobalization, we saw a rearrangement of international relations. And in fact, we had at that moment the idea, at least it was widely shared, that we could see certainly competition, economic competition, but not real geopolitical confrontation. Meanwhile, many things happened, and it was not only the pandemic and the recent conflict generated by the invasion of Ukraine by Russia that explained those developments. Indeed, it seems to me that even before the pandemic and this war in Ukraine, we already were seeing developments of a new kind of order, or if you want, a new kind of disorder in international relations. After the Second World War, in fact, we have seen the establishment of some kind of global order with the creation of the United Nations, but also what IMF, or the World Bank, the so-called Bretton Woods institutions. It was basically an order established by the United States and by the so-called West. At that time, there was a challenger to American supremacy, the Soviet Union, but we know how it developed afterwards. In economic terms, at that time, China was not relevant. Just to give you an example of my own experience, I remember when in 1992, in the European community, as was the name at that time of the European Union, when we were discussing around the table, together with President François Mitterrand from France, Prime Minister or Chancellor Helmut Kohl from Germany, or my predecessor, Jacques Delors, President of the European Commission, when we were analyzing the competitiveness of the European Union or the European community, we were comparing it at that time with the United States, with Japan, and with what at that time was called Asian tigers, including the Republic of Korea and Singapore, Hong Kong, and others. But not China. China, in the early 90s or late 80s, was not really a part of the global economic equation. Today, China is not only part of it, but probably defining dramatically all the developments in economic terms. The rise of China is, in my opinion, the single most transformational process in the last 30 years. And the rise of China has huge implications economically, politically, geopolitically. In fact, some people say that it's not only the rise of China, it's also a shift to Asia, something that was expressed, among others, by the famous sentence of President Obama, a pivot to Asia. In reality, the situation is more complex than that. When we analyze the situation, we see that it's not just a shift between continents that is taking place, but new lines of fracture that will have certainly a huge geopolitical, but also geoeconomic impact. In fact, even before the pandemic, we had American President Trump, who made the famous sentence, "Make America Great Again." No problem with that. We all know, some of us, including those who have been leading their countries, that we all want to make our countries as great as possible. That is the duty of any president or any prime minister, is to strive for the interests and values of the respective country. The problem was the way it was done. Because when the most important country in the planet, in terms of economic, technological, and military power, puts so clearly its own interest above the interest of others, or at least that perception, of course that has an impact on others. At the same time, we have seen already a development in China that was in favor of much more assertiveness, the traditional modesty of China that we know from the time of Deng Xiaoping. The way China was growing economically, but also growing in political and diplomatic influence that was more or less discreet, was changed, becoming a much more assertive goal, including with very clear tones of nationalism. This, I insist, was before the pandemic. The pandemic has accelerated all these trends. In fact, we could see already before the pandemic the tensions for inflation. Unfortunately, central banks and many economists did not see inflation coming when, in fact, we saw that the risks of deglobalization, by definition, will bring some inflation pressure. The current inflation that is a threat to many of our economies is not only determined by the pressure in terms of energy. Certainly, the costs of energy are pushing inflation up, but it has to do with some friction in the supply chains globally that has fueled precisely these movements of inflation. Some people said, including very competent economists, that the inflation was temporary. Yes, but everything in the world is temporary. The question is for how long and how deep. And so we now have this trade of inflation. So this is one of the characteristics of the current economic globalization. Not only we have a higher level of unpredictability, we have a more fragmented world, but we also have more costs in terms of global exchanges of goods and services. And we are feeling that very clearly in most of our economies. But then we had the pandemic. And let me say from that point of view that I've been following that as chairman of Gavi. Gavi is the Global Alliance for Vaccines. And since 1st of January 2021, I'm the chairman of Gavi. And I've been, together with my colleagues from COVAX, World Health Organization, UNICEF, and CEPI, we have been trying to provide a multilateral solution as a response to the world, namely to the more developing countries that could not on their own afford to buy vaccines. And so I could see firsthand the developments of vaccine nationalism, including with export embargoes, and with a movement that was in fact contributing to the onshoring, renationalization, bringing back supply chains. Just to give you an example, when the pandemic started in Europe, there was not a single paracetamol pill produced in Europe. Aspirin, that was in fact created in Europe some decades ago, we could not find it made in Europe. We had to import it from other parts of the world. And that had a huge impact. And it was not just about medicine, it was about vaccines, including vaccines that were made outside of Europe with European patents, but outside of Europe, and also in protective personal equipment. I can tell you an example of one of the biggest companies in the world of producing protective personal equipment that were doing it in China, and from one day to the other, the price of that masks were increased 1,000%, but that was not the real problem. The problem was that the supplier of this kind of masks could only export to the West after the local market was supplied. That had a huge impact in many quarters in Europe, and I'm sure also in the rest of the world. But as you may understand, I'm now trying to give you my reading of the situation today, namely from my European perspective. Today, the European Union is the #1 producer and exporter of vaccines, partly because some of those supply chains were brought back closer to Europe. And the same that I'm saying about Europe, we can say about China, about the United States, and about other very important global players. So we are seeing now, and I'm afraid this is going to continue, we are seeing the onshoring of and the bringing back of supply chains closer to the most important markets. And this trend is most likely going to continue. So the pandemic has accelerated dramatically some of those trends that were already of some protectionism or economic nationalism. And we are now in this situation. It is true that the pandemic also brought some other developments, including a very sudden development of digitization. According to some experts, in 1 year, we have done more than 5 years of transition to digitization. Not only through communication, the platforms that we now use for communication, Zoom or other platforms, but also in terms of financial transactions. So the financial world has been more and more digitized, including with attempts to have some cryptocurrencies, but also e-commerce in general. So this is a trend, this digitization, that has been accelerated and that can partly compensate for some friction in terms of the global supply chains. But now we have the problem of Russia and Ukraine. This is a real problem. And I'm one of those that believes the world is no longer the same after the 24th of February this year. And I'm measuring my words. The world is no longer the same. Some people believe this is basically a European issue. The Europeans should solve it. After all, there are other problems, there are other conflicts, terrible wars in other parts of the world. Why should this Russia-Ukraine crisis be considered a global crisis? Unfortunately, it is a tragedy, not only for Ukraine, for Europe, but for all the world. And I will tell you briefly why I believe this is the case. First of all, let's not forget that it was in Europe that we had the origin of the two world wars. They started as European wars, and they became world wars. And so in Europe, after the Second World War, there was the acceptance of the principle that by force, one country could not invade other. Like Nazi Germany had invaded some other countries, smaller countries, it will be considered inconceivable that in Europe, one country can invade another one and take parts of that country. But that's exactly what is happening. The biggest country in the planet, in geographical terms, Russia, by far the biggest country in the planet, is taking by force parts of another country. Not a small country. Ukraine geographically is more or less the size of France or even bigger than France, but certainly a smaller country than Russia. And a country that is a full member of the United Nations, with its borders recognized, with its sovereignty recognized, is invaded by a much bigger country in clear violation of all rules of international law, not only the general rules of international law, but also some specific guarantees that have been given to that country for denuclearization. As you remember, big part of the nuclear arsenal of former Soviet Union was in Ukraine. And for Ukraine to denuclearize after the end of the Second World War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, there were guarantees, specific guarantees given to that country that its territorial integrity, its national sovereignty will be fully respected. It was not respected. And so far, Russia is occupying a part of Ukraine that is more or less the size of my own country, Portugal. That's a part. It's relatively small compared to all Ukraine, but it's bigger than many European countries, the part of Ukraine that is now occupied by a foreign power. You can imagine the impact this has in Europe. A huge impact also, besides, of course, the tragedy in Ukraine itself, for the precedent it creates for other situations. Because if now we accept that as a precedent, it means, of course, the instability of many of the borders in Europe and also of the borders in other parts of the world. Ukraine is not part of the European Union, is not part of NATO, so there is not the collective duty of protection that all members of NATO have towards each other. But until now, Europe and NATO have been reacting very strongly in support of Ukraine, not in a direct confrontation with Russia. The policy has been defined of avoiding a direct military confrontation with Russia, but of course, Ukraine has been counting with the economic, but political, but also to some extent military support of the so-called West through intelligence, training, and also providing the providing of military equipment to that country. This is in fact a very serious and dangerous conflict where indeed the issue of nuclear weapons has been mentioned as a possibility of using them, including by Russia. So this is a scenario that no one would like to expect in Europe, but we have to face now. Now, the reason why I'm saying that this is not just a tragedy for Ukraine and a very worrying development for Europe is also because of the possibilities of escalation and ramifications of this war. The possibilities of escalation are there. We see the rhetoric going up almost every day. But also, we have seen the possible ramifications. Because Russia, that just before the conflict, had announced the policy with China of no limits in its friendship, has in fact been more and more close to China. China, until now, has not directly supported Russia in its invasion, but China has kept a very interesting position where it abstains in international fora, like the United Nations. United Nations, where 141 countries voted against the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, but China and some others, very few, have abstained. But at the same time that internationally China is abstaining, internally, in all the propaganda, in all the media, China is putting clearly the blame on the Western side, on the United States and on NATO, as if NATO was the aggressor, as if it was NATO that invaded Russia and not Russia that has invaded Ukraine. This is bringing, of course, closer a confrontation between the United States and China. Russia becomes more and more dependent on China because there was a package of sanctions unprecedented implemented against Russia, not only sanctions against some individuals, but economic sanctions, financial sanctions, including de-SWIFTization, so putting Russia basically out of the SWIFT systems of payments, but also the withdrawal of most of the relevant Western companies from Russia. Today we can say, from a Western perspective, that Russia became a pariah state. And nothing will be the same in Europe in the foreseeable future. It is not one of those situations that can be easily reversed by some kind of agreement. First of all, even if there is an agreement, which of course I believe most of us would like to see, it will be very difficult, if not possible, to come to the status quo ante in terms of relationship between Europe and NATO in general with Russia. I don't see it possible. That's why, most likely, Russia will become increasingly closer to China, and China is, from my point of view, in a situation that is not very comfortable, because China, that has certainly been the biggest beneficiary of globalization, when we see the evolution of the last 20, 30 years, the biggest winner of globalization in terms of global market share has certainly been China. Certainly not China only. Many other economies, including the Korean economy, have benefited a lot. But certainly, in relative terms, China is very important what it has gained with globalization. And certainly, China prefers to keep the world open for business, for their exports, namely the United States or Europe, and Russia, that is comparatively small. Russia, being the biggest country in the planet in geographic terms and the biggest exporter of fossil fuels, its GDP is smaller than Italy or even than Spain today. So Russia is a great case of complete failure from an economic point of view. It's a failed economic state. When you compare Russia with China, the last 30 years, we can see the situation. So China, of course, can, in a way, appear stronger because there is Russia more dependent from China, but China is, of course, preparing for a situation where some of the policies that are now implemented against Russia could also have some effect on China. So what we are seeing, and once again I'm measuring my words, is the great decoupling. The great decoupling. By that I mean a situation where Europe and the United States, or North America to be more precise, will be on one side and Russia and China on the other. And of course, the world has to choose. Some of us would prefer not to choose. I would say that Europe certainly will prefer not to choose. Europe needs global markets open. The success of Europe, namely of Germany, which is the biggest economy in Europe, is based on open markets. And I like to say, of course, that's our basic philosophy. Not only open markets, but open societies. But these markets and these societies are now at very risk. The decoupling with China already started in technological terms. We have seen the case of Huawei as a demonstration of this decoupling. When we saw the situation before, and when we saw that after some initiatives taken by the United States, probably the only matter where Republicans and Democrats in the United States agree is to be tough on China, and we can expect that consensus to continue, whatever the results are of the next elections, including the next presidential election. So the reality is that Huawei was replaced in many of our economies in the West. But there is already now a movement of withdrawing investment from China and also a much stronger screening in Chinese investments in Europe and in the United States and North America in general. An area, of course, where we have to see what's going to happen is the financial world. Because it seems to me that these restrictions that are already being applied in terms of technology, because technology, let's not forget, is also made of technologies that can have a dual use for civilian purposes, but for war, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotechnology, biosciences in general, including gene editing, all these matters are now under close scrutiny in the world from a military point of view, which of course brings an additional concern for all of us who want a world based on the principles of peace. But so if we see already these movements of decoupling in technology, in matters like data protection, in the internet, with an increased divergence in the internet, we can see, and when we see the results of the recent Congress of the Communist Party of China, that this growing ideological divergence will certainly increase the polarization in the world, namely between the United States and China. Others that would like to keep the world open for business, of course, are seeing these developments with concern. Now, this raises a fundamental question. That is going to be my last question. Can we still hope for a world where some multilateralism prevail? Because for some global public goods, we need global cooperation. We are not naive. I think most of us are not naive. If we had some illusions, maybe we already lost some of our illusions. But I believe it is still possible and desirable that when it comes to some global public goods, like global health, like the fight against climate change, the most important powers in the planet are able, in spite of their political, ideological difference, to come to some level of understanding and cooperation. But even that today is at risk. I remember I've been in all the G20 summits between 2008 and 2014. In fact, it was the European Union who came to the United States proposing the first G20 summits. At that time, we only had the G8. At the time, Russia was still part of the G8. And I remember one of the important partners that we decided to have in this global G20 was South Korea, and the Republic of Korea being a very important member of G20, because we understood that facing the great financial and sovereign debt crisis, it was not enough the G8. We needed to have China, India, Korea, Brazil, many other partners. The reality is that at that moment, and I've participated in those summits, we had some level of understanding and cooperation between our countries. For instance, to avoid a return to protectionism. And in spite of all the differences, for instance, the European Union cooperated with China, and China supported the European Union facing the so-called euro area crisis. Would it be possible today? Frankly, I think it will be much more difficult. Today, we are in a world where the flux is losing the war against friction. The flux of free exchanges, not only of goods, services, of people, ideas, is losing the war against friction. The friction of nationalism, protectionism, chauvinism, even xenophobia. And this is certainly a worrying development. So what we could hope for, I believe, and we should have strategies for that, is at least to keep the trade open. There will be certainly more restrictions in terms of investment that I think it's almost unavoidable. But to keep a minimum of trade flows open, that is necessary. In spite of all these developments, the reality is that trade is continuing to grow globally, but not at the same pace we are seeing before. But also, it will be wise and certainly desirable if the most important powers in the world, I would say namely the United States, China, the European Union, and others, agree in the G20 or in other formats that at least for some global public goods, some multilateralism is necessary and indispensable. In the European Union, we like multilateralism. By definition, we are multilateralists because we are today a union of 27 countries that they share their sovereignty and they take decisions by consensus most of the time in a permanent negotiation. So we are, I would say, intuitively, instinctively for multilateralism. Can the world also sustain this commitment to multilateralism? I think the threats are huge. The great decoupling is happening, but we should have the intelligence to pursue that way for peace, peace being the most important value. To conclude, and since we are in a very important conference about human resources and education and talent, let me just conclude one point. Certainly the talent we need for the future will be more and more in terms of science, technology, mathematics, because some of these technologies are the ones who are going to shape the new world, and unfortunately in a much more aggressive competition, this talent is necessary, but I hope that we still leave some room for the humanities, for studying human nature, for studying history, learning with mistakes of history. And one of the lessons that we know from history is that all forms of arrogance are forms of stupidity. It's important that our young people understand that arrogance is not a solution, that we should understand that the best way to serve the interests of our countries is to work together and understand that in spite of all our difference, there are some common public goods for which we should cooperatively work and to try to find global, cooperative, if possible, multilateral solutions. I thank you for your kind attention. Thank you.
네, 여러분 다시 한번 큰 박수 부탁드립니다. Thank you very much for your meaningful speech. 네, 조제 마누엘 바호 회장님께서 첫 번째 기조 연설과 또 소중한 제언들까지 더해 주셨는데요. 세계는 이제 이전과는 다르다라고 말씀을 또 해주셨습니다. 그렇죠. 돌이켜 보면 우리를 둘러싼 이 모든 환경과 또 관계들, 상황들이 급격하게 달라지고 있는데요. 뿐만 아니라 모든 것들이 상호 연결되어서 서로 다양한 영향을 주고 있는 것 같습니다. 이렇게 변화와 또 전환의 시대, 모든 것이 바뀌어가는 흐름 속에서 앞으로를 예측하는 것은 결코 쉬운 일이 아닐 텐데요. 첫 번째 기조 연설을 통해서 보다 넓은 시각으로 이 글로벌 흐름을 짚어볼 수 있었던 시간이 아니었나 생각이 듭니다. 덕분에 보다 선명한 미래를 조금 더 빨리 만나볼 수 있겠죠. 고맙습니다. 자, 이렇게 오늘 이른 오전부터 또 많은 분들 함께하고 계신데요. 글로벌 인재포럼 2022 개회식과 첫 번째 기조 연설은 여기서 먼저 마무리를 하도록 하겠습니다.